I'm talking about the nature of phantom limbs. Phantom limbs occur when people have had amputations, and lots of people have them. In the US, approximately 300,000 people have had limbs amputated, and the great majority of them have a phantom limb in the place where the limb used to be. For those who have phantom limbs, the phantom feels as if it's really there. When I move my arm around, of course, I feel my arm and I can feel it moving. But if I'd had my arm amputated, I would still feel as if my arm was there. I'd still be able to move it around. But the difference between a phantom arm and a real arm is obviously, first of all, that no one else can see it. It's not obviously there. And secondly, being a phantom, it can go through solid objects. So if I pushed a phantom arm through this desk, the phantom arm would just go straight through the desk, whereas, of course, a normal arm doesn't. So phantom arms feel real to the person who's got them, but for everybody else, they don't seem to be there, and that's why they're called phantoms. The appearance of the phantom occurs almost straight after the amputation, and in a booklet produced by the American Veterans Association for veterans, military veterans who were undergoing amputations, this pamphlet called What to Expect When You Have Your Amputation warns them that if their leg is going to be removed, the biggest problem that leg amputees have in the first few days after the operation is trying to get out of bed and walk on it. It feels so real. They try and walk on it and then they fall over because it's not there. Or people who've had arms amputated, for the first few weeks after the amputation, when they haven't got used to it, will reach out with their arm to pick up the telephone or reach out to pick up a cup of coffee. And of course, it doesn't work. Quite often, phantom limbs have pain in them, and although this is called phantom pain, the pain is real enough for those who suffer from it. And it's a very difficult medical problem because conventional methods of treating pain don't work. Painkillers don't seem to work. And it's a serious problem. I'll come back to that later. I've collected a lot of stories of what it's like to have a phantom from people who have them. I did this partly through appealing for information through an American magazine called Veterans of Foreign Wars magazine, and in Britain through the newsletter of the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association. For example, in America, I had a story from someone called Leo Unger, who lost his legs when he was fighting in Europe in November 1944. Both his legs were amputated below the knees. And this is what he told me. From the very first day, I have always had the feeling that my legs and feet were still in place. Early on, I had severe phantom pains that felt like balls of fire going down my limbs and off my toes. After 20 years, I seldom got that feeling, but I do often feel the bones in my feet were just broken, just as they were when I was wounded. I learned to elevate my legs and the feeling ceases. So everyone's got their own stories about their phantoms and how they feel. But the stories are remarkably consistent and they're remarkably common. Almost everyone who has an amputation has a phantom. And even people who are born without limbs often have phantoms. About 10 to 20% of people who are born without arms or legs have a phantom arm or leg. So they're not just memories of the missing limb. Obviously they're less common with congenital limblessness, but nevertheless the fact that some people have these phantoms shows it's not just a memory. It's not only phantom limbs either. There are other kinds of phantom result from operations, many women who've had mastectomies have phantom breasts. Some men who've had their penis amputated have phantom penises and even phantom erections. And also internal organs can produce phantoms. People who've had their bladder removed often have phantom bladders, and this is troublesome because they often feel the bladder's full when in fact they haven't got a bladder at all. So phantoms are a widespread phenomenon, not simply to do with limbs. And in fact, anyone can have a phantom. If you're anaesthetized with an epidural in the spinal cord, which anaesthetizes the legs, about 10% of people who have anesthesia of the legs feel phantom legs. If they close their eyes, they can move the phantom leg around. And when they open their eyes, they see that where they thought the phantom leg was is not where the actual leg is. And usually the phantom snaps back into the real leg quite quickly. People who are having operations on their arms often have brachial plexus anesthesia, which anesthetizes the whole arm. And in this case, about 90% of people feel they have a phantom arm. And again, if they close their eyes, they can move the phantom around. And if they open them and it's not in the position where the real arm is, then the phantom quickly goes back into the real arm. The fact that any one of us could have a phantom through anesthesia temporarily shows that they're not just produced by changes in the brain as a result of amputation. One theory of phantoms, which advanced by the Indian-American scientist Ramachandran, who's written a very interesting book on phantoms called Phantoms in the Brain, it points out that after amputation you can have rewiring going on in the brain, and that this rewiring could perhaps sometimes produce phantoms. But the fact they're produced straight away after operations and temporarily through anesthetics shows that they're not primarily a result of rewiring in the brain, although rewiring may affect the phantoms. They just appear. They're part of the body image that people experience, which can diverge from the actual body, as in the case of limbs moving to a different position where they really are, and then going back into position when they open their eyes. Phantom limbs play an important part when people have prostheses, artificial arms or legs. And doctors commonly say that the phantom animates the prosthesis, fitting it like a hand in a glove. And this is one of the ways in which people can quickly adapt to using an artificial limb, because the animation of the limb by the phantom makes it much easier to get used to it. Sometimes after an amputation, the phantom will shrink over several years, so an arm phantom may shrink until the hand is only a foot or a few inches from the shoulder. But if people start wearing an artificial arm, usually the phantom expands again to fill the prosthesis. And sometimes when people have phantom pain, when they put on their prosthesis, the phantom pain vanishes. When they take it off, it starts hurting again. So the neurologist Oliver Sacks called this the good phantom and the bad phantom being the painful one, and the good one when it's helping them with the prosthesis. It's the same phantom, but it works differently when there's a prosthesis present and when there isn't. People have had amputations since ancient times, and in Egyptian tombs there are people who've had amputations, and they not only happen through accident, but in the Islamic world it was a form of punishment when thieves had their right hands or arms chopped off. There's been a long knowledge about phantom limbs, and Admiral Lord Nelson, the famous British admiral, had a phantom arm after he lost his arm in a sea battle, and he was very curious about it and interested in it. And for him, he said it was proof of the existence of the soul, because if he could have a phantom arm that, when there wasn't a real arm there, what about a whole phantom body? And actually, in out-of-the-body experiences, which happen when people have near-death experiences, some people can just travel out of the body at will. They have a whole phantom body, of course. We all have a phantom body in our dreams, the dream body. Every night when we dream, we have another body different from the physical body lying in bed, which, as the dream body is, as they say, a phantom body. So phantoms shade off into all sorts of interesting phenomena, like out-of-the-body experiences and dream bodies, and obviously have a lot of implications about who we are, what our body is, and what our body image is. Now, from the point of view of materialists, who still make up the majority of the scientific world, and mechanistic materialism is still the orthodoxy, phantoms are simply produced inside the brain. The whole body image is produced inside the brain, and sometimes you see models of the brain with a homunculus, a little man in the cerebral cortex representing the sensory or the motor cortex, with different parts of the brain representing legs, arms, tongue, etc. So the usual materialist view is that the phantom is in the brain. It's not where it seems to be. If I have a phantom arm, it's not where it seems to be here, where my arm or phantom arm is, but it's actually somewhere inside my head. And in fact, the materialist theory tries to say that all our experience is inside our head. When you see the picture of me on the screen right now, that image of me is inside your head. There's a little Rupert somewhere inside your head. There's an image of a screen inside your head. When you look around you, as I'm looking out of the window now at some trees, the official view is the image of those trees is inside my brain, not out there where it seems to be. And if I feel a pain in my big toe, the official view is that the pain is actually inside my head, not in my toe. It's merely referred to the toe, although it's not clear how such a referral process could happen. So the usual assumption is that in the brain there's a body schema or a body image which includes the image of the phantom limb, and that when the arm is amputated, the body schema or image inside the brain remains the same, creating the illusion that the phantom limb is out there, whereas in fact it's all in the brain. Many people who've had amputations have been told by doctors that their phantoms are all inside their brain. It's not how they experience it, but they're told that's how it really is. Now, the point I'm trying to make, and the point of this talk, is really to explore alternative possibilities. It's simply a dogma that all our thoughts inside our brains, all our images are inside our heads, and I discuss it in my book, The Science Delusion, called Science Set Free in the United States. So if you want more details on all this, do take a look at The Science Delusion. I think that the phantom limbs could be the field of the missing limb. I think that that our limbs and our bodies have fields that shape them. And the idea of body fields was first put forward in the 1920s under the name morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. The idea is that as we grow and develop as embryos, there's a kind of invisible field that shapes the developing body. And the same is true of plants. As a flower or a leaf grows, a flower field or a leaf field shapes the developing organ. These fields are conceived of by analogy with magnetic fields, and as you know, magnetic fields are inside and around magnets. And the whole point of fields is that they're regions of activity. They integrate areas of space, they connect things together within that region of activity in space or space-time, since of course they persist through time. And they're holistic. fields are intrinsically holistic. You can't take a slice out of the Earth's gravitational field. You either have a field there or you don't. If you cut a magnet in two, say you've got a bar magnet and you cut it in two, you don't get one half magnet with a north pole and the other half with the south pole. Each magnet has a complete magnetic field and a north and a south pole. And the field is not just inside the magnet, as anyone who's seen iron filings around magnets will remember. There's a whole pattern of lines of force around the magnet. The field extends around it as well as being within it. And when you have magnetic poles attracting each other, a north pole attracting a south pole here, then the field lines and the structure of the field is quite different from when they're repelling each other, where you have a north pole and a north pole in the one on the right. So we don't normally see these fields. They're invisible, but they have definite effects. The gravitational field of the Earth we don't see, but it has definite effects. That's why we're not floating around in the air right now. We're being held down by the gravitational field. And the Earth's gravitational field is keeping the moon in its orbit, and the moon's gravitational field is pulling on the oceans, causing the tides to rise and fall. So we're used to the idea of invisible fields. This is not some occult or mysterious concept. It's part of mainstream science. Quantum theory is based on fields as well. An electron is a vibration in an electron field. A proton is a vibration in a proton field. So the idea of morphogenetic or form-shaping fields is that living organisms also have fields which shape their development. And like magnetic fields, they automatically integrate what's going on. If you cut an organism in half, of course most organisms just die, but some organisms like flatworms, if you cut them in half or even into lots of little bits, each part can grow into a new flatworm. If you cut a willow tree into lots of little cuttings, each cutting can grow into a new tree. So each part of it has a complete field for the whole organism. Just as if you cut a magnet into lots of little pieces, each piece is a little magnet with a complete magnetic field. And in experiments in embryology, it's long been known that organisms have this holistic property. For example, here you see a dragonfly embryo within the dragonfly egg, and on the left you see a normal dragonfly embryo which fills the egg. On the right you see a case where the egg was tied in the middle with a thread and the top part was killed. And the bottom part of the egg, which would normally give rise to the rear part of the embryo, now gives rise to a small but complete embryo with a head as well as a posterior region. So this, you see, is one of the ways in which biologists think about development through these fields, which, like magnetic fields, have this holistic property. What I'm suggesting is that the morphogenetic fields of the limb are still there after an amputation. And in some animals, for example newts, if you cut off an arm, the stump can regrow a new limb. If you cut it off in the upper arm, it will regrow the rest of the limb. If you cut it off in the lower part of the limb, it will regrow the missing part till it produces a complete limb again. This implies that the ability to shape the developing organism, to get the cells to take up the right place and so on, is governed or shaped by some shaping or formative influence, the morphogenetic field. Although newts can regenerate their limbs after damage, frogs, which are also amphibia, usually don't. But by treating the stump of a frog with a mild electric current, or by some suitable chemical treatments, it's possible to induce them to regrow limbs as well. So the capacity is there, but normally it's inhibited. So what I'm suggesting is that in the case of phantom limbs, when people have lost a limb, the field of the limb is still there, and what they're experiencing is the field of the missing limb. What they're experiencing is there where it seems to be, just as they experience it, not inside their brain in some unexplained way. So then the question becomes, can you actually test for these phantom limbs? Is it possible to detect the phantom limb where it seems to be? And for that I've developed a simple experiment. If you're interested in more details in the literature, I describe it in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. One of them concerns phantom limbs. So the experiment is very, very simple. It involves amputees. I've worked with arm amputees because they're easier to work with than leg amputees. And it also involves people who practice subtle energy medicine. There are various people who, some osteopaths, some Reiki practitioners, and others who work with what they call subtle fields or the subtle body, which I think are different ways of talking about what I'm calling morphogenetic fields. And such practitioners believe that they can treat bodies through working on the fields of the body, not just through direct physical and chemical methods as in regular medicine. So in my experiments, what I do is see if people who work with subtle fields can actually feel the phantom arms of amputees. Now obviously you have to guard against subjective bias and people thinking that they, imagining they can feel it when they can't. So you have to have an objective test. And how I do these tests is by having a barrier, usually a door, and there's a door between the amputee who pushes their arm through the door, and being a phantom, the phantom arm comes through the door and will stick out the other side. And on this side of the closed door I have a subtle energy practitioner, who an osteopath or a Reiki practitioner or anyone who volunteers who thinks they might be able to detect a subtle phantom arm. And it's a randomized test. So what I do is mark out the door in 6 regions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, on both sides, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the amputee is with my research assistant, who selects a number at random by throwing a die. Say the die comes up with number 2, then the amputee pushes their phantom arm through panel 2. So there's a phantom arm sticking through panel number 2. Then on the other side, I'm doing this blind. I don't know which panel the arm's sticking through. And of course, neither does the person who's being tested, the subtle energy practitioner. And I then say to them, can you test these different 6 areas and say which one the phantom arm is sticking through? So they feel and they try and detect where it is, and then they say a number between 1 and 6. Say they say 2, they're right. If they say 4, they're not. By chance, by pure guessing, they'd be right one time in 6. I've now done this experiment quite a few times, and the overall results are highly significant statistically. They're not right every time, but in some cases they're right 50% of the time, when they'd only be right one time in 6, normally about 16%. So this test does seem to show that people can detect phantom limbs where they seem to be. Some people say, well, all right, people can detect the phantom limb in these tests, but how do you know it's not just telepathy? Just feeling where the person intended to put their limb rather than the limb itself. Well, this is a relatively sophisticated objection, and if the experiment moves the debate forward so that the main objection to the results is telepathy as an alternative explanation, I think that's definitely has moved us forward. But of course we can do tests for that. One way is to ask the person to imagine putting their phantom limb through panel 2, for example, instead of putting the actual limb through. And then you can see whether people can detect their intention or thoughts about it rather than the actual phantom. The other way is to have them, instead of pushing the phantom arm through panel 2, step back 3 or 4 feet, so that when they extend their phantom arm, it doesn't actually go through the door, so it's no longer actually extending through the door. And if people can't detect it when it's not there, but only when it is actually sticking through the door, this would be evidence that they really are detecting the phantom limb. Now, it may be possible to detect phantom limbs in other ways as well. It's conceivable that they interact with random event generators, Geiger counters, mass spectrometers, cathode ray tubes, all sorts of apparatus. And the simplest way to test this, if you've got a laboratory, or even if you just do it at home, is to switch on all the different bits of apparatus and then ask an amputee to push their phantom arm into the Geiger counter or into the random event generator. And if any of them show a deflection when the phantom arm is placed in the apparatus, this would show a way of measuring the interaction. I don't think the phantom is primarily electrical, but it may well interact with electrical apparatus. It may be detectable through doing very simple tests of this kind. As far as I know, no one's done them, because within the medical world it's simply taken for granted it's all in the brain, and these would be meaningless experiments. However, they'd cost extremely little, and they'd be extremely fascinating. Many amputees might not want to push their phantom arm into electrical apparatus for fear of getting a phantom shock. But I've found the easiest people to work with are veterans. Almost by definition, they're braver than most people. They've fought in battles, and they're also much more adventurous than most people within the medical world. So here's a very simple approach to looking for the nature of phantom limbs through interaction with electrical or electronic apparatus. And the other way, as I say, is through doing these tests of individuals trying to detect the phantom, subtle energy healers trying to detect them. Interestingly, some subtle energy healers, particularly those in a form of healing called therapeutic touch, say that they can feel phantoms, and they actually work with amputees who have phantom pain and massage their phantom leg. So they give a phantom massage, a subtle massage to a missing limb, and some of them claim this is successful in relieving the pain. The pain can also be relieved by psychological changes. Ramachandran developed an ingenious method where amputees would have their real arm in one place, and they'd have a mirror, and then the phantom arm would be behind the mirror. But when they look at it and they see the reflection of the real arm where the phantom is, and just seeing it as normal, seeing it as there, can help to relieve the pain in the phantom limb. So this all interacts with our minds, and indeed they are in the mind, but I'm suggesting that the mind is extended throughout the body and throughout the fields of the body. Well, this is a fascinating topic of research which has many implications for understanding the relation of mind and body. The research itself costs almost nothing, and if you're a subtle energy practitioner, or if you have friends or colleagues who are, I suggest you actually take up doing this research and recruit amputees through local veterans associations. Much easier to do that than through hospitals. I have tried doing it through hospitals myself, but as soon as you tell them why you're interested, then there's a kind of retraction, and people get defensive and worried and upset that this could be heretical or something like that. It raises all sorts of issues for official doctors in official institutions. But for veterans, it's just a personal decision, and many of them are happy and indeed excited to take part. So if you are an osteopath or a therapeutic touch practitioner, a Reiki practitioner, if you douse people for to try and diagnose physical problems, or have any other kind of therapeutic skill of this kind, do try experiments with phantom limbs. This could be a breakthrough in understanding the relation of mind and body. It's something that thousands of people could take part in. You don't need a grant, you don't need permission, you can just do this, do this at home. And I think the results will be very fascinating when we know more about it. Preliminary results are already in, and they're very encouraging. So I hope it won't be long before we have some better answers about the nature of phantom limbs.